Okay, everyone. So the final segment in this chapter's lecture before our quiz tomorrow is to kind of officially talk through um, how we change the Constitution. So we've really kind of in this chapter explored not just the history of how we got it and some of the major debates that were kind of being argued over and some of the compromises and sort of how we came up with this document that is now 250 years old and has guided our nation for all of its history. But then, in addition to how we got it and what it is, we need to talk about how do we change it? How do we amend the Constitution? And so the first question we're going to explore in today's lecture is um, quite simply that. How can the Constitution be formally amended? And so you can already sort of expect that there's going to be an informally amended addition to this as well. So let's take a look at what the Constitution says about itself. How do you change it? And so first thing, we need to be clear that the Constitution was very purposely made to be difficult to change. We saw that in yesterday's assignment where there has been thousands of proposed amendments over the years, but only 27 of them have ever cleared. And the reason for that is exactly that. It's supposed to be hard. The thought process was by making it hard, you're going to weed out a lot of the dumb and ridiculous amendments to the Constitution that you read about in yesterday's assignment. And so, the difficulty of amending it comes first in the fact that it takes two different stages in order to do it. The first stage is what we're going to call proposal, right? And so the proposal stage is what needs to happen before there's an official vote on actually ratifying this or a specific amendment. And so how does proposal look? What is the stage of proposal? You can kind of see it on the graphic on the left, but let's kind of explore it. The most common way of doing it, far and away the most common way of doing it, is to hold a vote in Congress. Now, as we've already looked at with the Connecticut Compromise, we know that the United States Congress is broken up into two parts, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. And so, in order for proposal to be successful, in the most common way, is that there would be a vote in each branch of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and we don't just need a simple majority vote in each branch. We need a full two-thirds vote in each branch of Congress, which, as you can already sort of guess, getting two-thirds of any senators or House of Representatives members to agree on something is a very high bar. In the Senate, that means 67 people in the Senate out of the total 100 need to vote yes. We want to move this forward. And the same thing in the House, it's something like 270 something. House of Representatives members need to vote yes, we want to move it forward. But the Constitution was also leery of kind of Congress basically not wanting to amend itself, right? Not wanting to change itself. And so the Constitution and the Founding Fathers did create a seldom used, never used path that you could also get proposal by allowing national conventions to be called in the states, um, or a national convention could be requested by the states if two-thirds of the state legislatures said yes. So there's 50 states in the country, and so just quick, simple math would be if 34 of them said we want to call a national convention to discuss ratifying a new amendment, then Congress would have no choice but to call that national convention. And so, to summarize and maybe make clear what I just said, Congress can initiate a proposed amendment themselves, or Congress can be forced to initiate a proposed amendment. And these are the two paths. After either one of these two paths has been successfully completed, we're now at what's called the ratification stage for an amendment. And the ratification stage, ratification being a vocabulary word, means to ratify something, means to pass it. And so in this case, let's take the first option. Let's say in both the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, two-thirds of each of those bodies voted, yes, we want to move it forward. At that point, then it goes back down to the states, right? And this was a model designed by the federal or by the founding fathers to ensure that the federal government wasn't in charge of policing itself. We know that checks and balances are a frequent theme of um, of the Constitution. And in this case, the check being put here is that the Congress and the federal government controls the proposal stage, but the states also have to want it. And so in this case, the most common way of pursuing the ratification stage would then, after it's proposed in Congress, it would go out to all of the state legislatures, and in the Colorado State House up in Denver, and in Sacramento in California, or any of the other state capitals, um, the state legislatures would then vote whether they want to ratify. And so, one by one, the state legislators vote to ratify. And if you get 3/4 of the 50 states, boom, you have an amendment formally passed. They could also do, let's say, and this is the other thing, another check and balance that the Congress put in play. They said, well, what if the amendment is going to restrict the powers of the state legislatures? And so the state legislatures themselves are not going to want to pass that. But it's good for the nation and the people want it. Then they created this other back avenue way, again, a second option, that conventions could be called by the peoples of those states in 3/4 of the states, and that would also count as ratification. But far and away, the most common path towards ratification of each of the 27 amendments that exist would be step one, 2/3 vote in each part of Congress. That would move it forward down to the states. And the second step, the most common path, would be 3/4 of the state legislatures say yes. And so I think the last point I want to make before I'm going to ask you to pause to answer the two questions here associated with this particular slide is the last point is what you notice here is that the president themselves has no clear role on what they can do to get an amendment, right? There is no role for the president. The president doesn't get to veto it. The president doesn't get to propose it. The president is completely shut out of the amendment process, right? The layers of involvement are both the Congress, and the state legislatures. Pause now to answer the two questions associated with this slide. But I clearly lied. There was 3 questions, but let's go to the next slide. So let's take a look. So we've gone through kind of how amendments are passed. Let's actually kind of take a closer look at what is history saying? What are the patterns that are emerging for what amendments have actually gotten through these very high hurdles? Number one, I think it's clear to say that from the time the Constitution has passed, including the first 10, which is the Bill of Rights, the Constitution has, as a trend, kind of continually become more egalitarian and more democratic as it's gone on, right? In general, freedoms and restrictions have not built up with people. They have been taken away or greater freedoms extended, right? First, that was with the passage of the Bill of Rights, which we already said was kind of a necessity in order for states to even agree to passing the Bill of Rights, or in order for the states to even ratify the Constitution. They had to promise, the founding fathers had to promise to create a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that they passed down. And these first 10 amendments, including, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of press, the freedom not to house troops in your house, the right to a jury trial, all these, first 10 amendments that we take for granted in our society, they gave more democratic freedoms to American people. But that pattern has also extended into the 13th and 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment forbids slavery, with a convenient exception other than for prisoners, which to my knowledge, it doesn't happen in the country, but the Constitution actually still allows convicted felons in prisons to work for free. So that is the only constitutional exception to slavery, fun fact. But the 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment, which we're going to talk about a lot later in the year, ensured equal protection under the law. The 19th Amendment extended voting rights to women. Um, and so as we track here and we're looking, why is it going this way? As we track here and we're looking, in general, the 27 that have made it through have generally expanded rights to people. The exception with that would be, um, the amendment that was originally passed um, and then basically overturned with a later amendment, which was removing the right of people to consume alcohol, right, in prohibition. But of the 27 that have gotten through, the vast majority have made our country a more egalitarian, a more democratic place. And so, as I've already said, only 27 have gotten through because the founding fathers have um, really pushed hard to make this a difficult process, to make it show if something is good enough to get through the amendment process, then it probably should be. Um, an example of one that's teetering on the doorstep that's a fun story to tell when we talk about the amendment process would be the forthcoming, potentially, 28th Amendment, which deals with the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed and passed in both houses of Congress with a two-thirds majority vote in 1972. The ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, basically prohibited any sort of discrimination on the basis of sex. Um, and so the Equal Rights Amendment passed by Congress in 1972, was then ratified by um, a bunch of different states. And I actually have an update here that's a fun update in that the Equal Rights Amendment just basically is, in theory, going to become law because um, in 1972, when it went out to the states, it died a couple states short. And you can see on the map, the blue states ratified it and the yellow states did not. But over the last couple of years, a couple different states have jumped on board and ratified it, finishing with the final state to do so, Virginia, in January of this year. Now, there is some debate among constitutional legal scholars as to whether there was a timeline on amending, and because it took 50 years or 48 years to actually be ratified in the required number of states, does it still stand? That is a debate that's being worked through the courts right now, but I'm happy to tell you that we might have a 28th Amendment here sometime soon because as of January of this year, there has now been the required 3/4 of state legislatures have passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Moving forward, um, we also have had talk of a balanced budget amendment that basically the United States has to balance the budget every year and that we cannot continue borrowing. You can see here it's gotten through Congress, or it's been called in state conventions. And looking at this, let's just look. The green or light green are states that have an active balanced budget convention resolution already approved. Um, Yellow is kind of targeting it. It never happened. And the white states have not taken it up. And so this is another one that's being talked through, but I would say is unlikely to pass. And so finally here to finish today, we've talked about how it can be formally changed to a formal process, right? 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of state legislatures. That's how you could formally change it. But as we know, the Constitution has only been formally changed 27 times, but it has changed its meaning over the years based off of some informal ways that the Constitution has changed. And so in this slide, we're going to look at how can the Constitution be informally changed. And the first question you're going to need to look at here is I want you to, maybe after this slide, talk about the difference between formal changes to the Constitution and informal changes to the Constitution. Put that in your own words, what that means. Formal, you kind of have it in writing. It's in the Constitution. It's now one of the amendments. It is part of the Constitution. Informal is what? And so let's take a look at that. First thing that we're going to talk about with how the Constitution can be informally changed is through judicial interpretation. It has often been argued that the Constitution is a living document, that it is made incredibly short, right? When you have the entire law of the land on which our entire country rests on, it's only 17,000 words and roughly 16 pages. That's phenomenally short. Um, and so, how did this really short document come to